I mean, totally unearned, but I'll take it. Thank you very much. You don't even know who I am. I'm Aidan Flax-Clark. I work here at the library, and I am part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. So thank you, all of you, for being here in this room. Thank you to everyone who's watching online tonight. We've got a lot of people watching online. You all have a lot of things that you can choose to do with your time, and I'm grateful that you chose to spend it with us. And with our guests, who are Noah Baumbach and Reggie Ugwu, who are going to speak about Noah's new movie, White Noise. Yeah, give it up. Hopefully some of you have seen it already. Those of you who haven't yet will have chances, and you're going to get to see some clips tonight. It's an adaptation, of course, of Don DeLillo's seminal 1985 National Book Award-winning novel, White Noise. And if you've never read the novel, or perhaps you want to brush up on it before you see the movie, you can, of course, check it out with your New York Public Library card, which everyone in this room, I'm sure, has, and I don't need to shame anyone about how they don't have a library card, right? I see potential shame over there, but we'll find you afterward. We have it in print. We have it as an ebook on our app Simply E, and even as an audiobook that you can get for free on our app Simply E, so check it out. I've been revisiting it this past week, and it's really quite a book. We're just thrilled to be able to host an event like this about bringing a book to film. This is, we're sort of nerds here about books, so this is kind of the perfect Live from NYPL event. And this event, as with all of our Live from NYPL events, are made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our wonderful supporters near and far. Thank you for your support. And speaking of the intersection of books and film, next week, Robert Caro, Robert Gottlieb, and Lizzie Gottlieb are going to be here to talk about Lizzie's tremendous new documentary, Turn Every Page, which is about the 50-year relationship between Robert Caro and Robert Gottlieb, who is his editor and has edited every single one of his books since The Power Broker. Also a tremendous film. And it's unfortunately sold out in person, but it will be live streamed, so please go to nypl.org/live and register if you haven't. It's going to be another great conversation. They'll be speaking with the Knopf editor-in-chief, Jordan Pavlin. You might have noticed that there are some note cards on your seats. Noah will be glad to take some questions, a few, at the end. You can write them down on your note cards, and people will come by to collect them. I encourage you to write legibly for Reggie's sake, and I encourage you to ask questions. And if you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat. We will also get those. We'll make sure that they get up here as well. So please start writing them anytime, and they'd love to hear from you. White Noise is in theaters now, and it will come out on Netflix on December 30th, I believe. Is that correct? Great. So I'd like to thank Chanel James and everyone else at Netflix for partnering with us on tonight's program. It's a pleasure to work with you, and I really encourage you to both go see it in the theater and then see it again in Netflix. This is a movie that bears multiple watchings. But for now, you'll get to watch a few clips from it tonight during the conversation, so let's get right to it. Please join me in welcoming Reggie Ugwu and Noah Baumbach.
Hello.
Hello.
This is exciting. I want to apologize. I'm a little hoarse from blabbing too much, but I promise I have not been exposed to any toxic events, airborne or otherwise. Thanks for joining us, Noah.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Congratulations on a tremendous film.
Thank you.
I wanted to start because when they asked me to do this, it put me in a little bit of a bind. I was very excited to do it, but I was in a bit of a bind because at the time I had not yet read the novel White Noise by Don DeLillo, the 1985 seminal National Book Award-winning novel. But I thought there might be an opportunity there. Instead of reading the book first and then seeing the film as I had planned to do, I thought since I was talking to you, I'd take the opportunity to just kind of experience it purely as a work of cinema. And so I did that, and I loved it. And I thought it was so exhilarating and hilarious. And I laughed out loud a lot.
Good, good.
And I was like, this movie is uproariously funny. This is like maybe the most uproarious Noah has been. And then I read the novel, and I realized that you basically lifted every line of dialogue from DeLillo, which is a really fascinating choice to me. And so for the purposes of this conversation, I thought maybe we'd do the opposite of what I did and start with the book. What is your relationship with the book? Where did it start, and what has it meant to you over the years?
Well, to what you were saying about lifting the dialogue, I'll say I was following, I think when Joel and Ethan Coen were asked how they adapt, I think the answer was that Joel holds the book open and Ethan types. So that's what I did, but I had to do both. My relationship with the book was I read it. My dad had recommended it to me when he read it when it came out. I read it a few years after it came out. I was a teenager, and I loved it then. I mean, I thought it sort of opened up narratively what books could be, what art could be. It was an exciting thing to read at the time. And certain elements stayed with me, of course, throughout the years. The cloud and the pill and the motel. Like I had these sort of visions, sort of half-remembered things that I'm sure I had changed, rewrote in my head even as time went on. And then it was someone brought the book up to me around the end of 2019. Friends of mine at 824, Daniel Katz and David Fenkel, and they had the rights to it. And I at the time I wasn't interested in doing anything with the book, but I thought, I'd love to reread it and just see what it feels like. So I started rereading it, and I was really kind of, I was just so, I kind of taken with, I mean, thematically, certainly with, and sort of the details and the sort of, it just felt so much like the world I felt I was living in, but also the tone, that kind of, that DeLillo kind of elevated reality, that it's that way the world feels sometimes, that is when you feel like, for me, it's like when you feel like you say, the world feels strange to me, and it often, I feel like, happens after traumatic events. I mean, certainly living in New York after 9/11, I had that feeling. I had that feeling after Trump was elected. I had that feeling after my father died. These things where suddenly everything that's familiar is familiar and unfamiliar. And I feel like DeLillo has that in the tone of it. And I was really interested in trying to do something like that in a movie. And then the pandemic happened just as I was finishing it, and we were in New York, and I started to have that feeling, and I felt like this also coincided, I should say, after Marriage Story. It was the first time in my career that I didn't know what I wanted to make next. I didn't have a thing ready. I've always had something kind of finding its way in the back of my head, so that when I'm finishing something, I'm often on to something else. And that I didn't have that. And I felt like this book was expressing something that I was feeling in both abstractly and also in more specific ways. And so I just thought, well, as an exercise, I don't even know when we're going to make movies again. I'm just going to see if this is possible.
Yeah. In the book, for people who are maybe like me, 2 weeks ago, is about this family in kind of a small town, Midwestern type college town, who have their lives upended by what is apparently a large toxic chemical spill. And it sort of plunges the whole community into chaos, temporarily at least. And I'm curious for you, going through the pandemic, reading the book, going back to the book, what are the things that you sort of recognized in our reactions to the pandemic that were kind of parallels to what DeLillo had written 30 years prior?
Well, I think certainly, speaking for myself, I mean, I had Marriage Story in February. I was in Los Angeles, and Marriage Story was going to open in China theatrically, and then, but we were hearing about COVID in China, and so I was told that it was being delayed, and I saw it as totally. I saw it as totally other. I saw it as, that there was something happening somewhere else, and not, and went about, did my Q&A that night, and went about my life. And then, come March in New York, this sort of, you were hearing these things, and I saw that entire sort of dinner scene both in the book and in the movie of White Noise as essentially what I felt like we were going through as a country, but you were watching it with the family in the movie at that moment, and that sort of, some people are ready immediately to jump on it. The kids in the movie are ready to, this is happening. But Jack sort of being the slowest moving and the one who is, the most addicted to comfort and his own sort of sense of how he feels the world should be and how he wants life to be, takes forever. And I found it hilarious as it's depicted in the book, and I feel like it's sort of anxiously hilarious in the movie, but also so telling about, what it takes to jostle us out of our comfort, And I mean, DeLillo's novel's in 3 parts, and and I followed that in the movie because I felt that was also spoke very much to the moment, in the sort of sense of we both have our the part 1 is essentially following a family going through their daily life, their daily rituals, their routines, the comfort of ordinary life, the making breakfast, the going to the supermarket, going to work, but at the same time we sense that something is in the cracks, something is coming, there's something underneath. And part 2, essentially, it cracks open, and this cloud, as you talk about, comes to, and it's like, I saw it as death comes and announces itself. And it's not necessarily going to take you now, but it's saying, I'm here. And part 3 is is them returning to their routines and their lives and trying to go about it in the same way, but with this new information. And of course, we also have kind of the personal story, the story of the marriage and the things that were not being addressed or looked at, the things that were hidden, which of course relate to death as well, come, kind of crack open as well. And so I found that both very compelling narratively and also cinematically, because I could do things, in the beginning of the movie, the camera kind of follows the characters, and it's sort of, it enables this notion that we control our own lives and our own movements. And then once the cloud comes into their lives, the camera starts to break off from them and starts to do other things. And I'm always interested in movies, how when the narrative or the characters, when things start to shift or change, that dramatically and aesthetically and cinematically, you have the ability to change, and styles can change, and I mean, it can happen in small ways, like in Marriage Story with when Adam sings "Being Alive." It's something that has shifted for him in the movie, gives him the sort of ability to sing this song. It also gives the camera the ability to push in, which it hasn't done at that point in the movie. And I love that. I think that's sort of a thing. But this movie offers many opportunities for that, because it's a kind of wilder journey.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be a perfect time to show the first clip that we have for you guys tonight. That's clip 1 in the back for the Airborne Toxic event, if we can get that going.
Where does it happen?
They're using leaf blowers to blow stuff onto the spill.
What kind of stuff?
I don't know, but it's supposed to make the spill harmless. Which doesn't explain what they're doing with the actual plume.
They're keeping it from getting bigger. When do we eat?
I don't know.
If it gets any bigger, it'll get here with or without a wind.
It won't get here.
How do you know?
Because it won't.
The radio calls it a feathery plume, but it's not a plume.
That's what Dad said.
What is it?
It's like a shapeless growing thing, a dark black breathing thing of smoke.
Why do they call it a plume then?
The airtime is valuable.
they
They
said
can't
what
go
kind of
into
chemical
long
it
torture
is?
It's called
description.
niodine derivative, or niodine D. We saw it in a movie in school on toxic waste.
What does it cause?
The movie wasn't sure what it does to humans. Mainly it was rats growing urgent lumps.
But that's what the movie said. What does the radio say?
Skin irritation and sweaty palms.
Sweaty palms and rats.
The radio,
But
not
then
the
they updated it to nausea, vomiting, shortness of breath.
The radio or the movie?
Both.
No, it won't come this way.
How do you know?
Because it won't. It's perfectly common still today. When there's a wind this time of year, it blows that way, not this way.
What if it blows this way?
It won't.
But what if just this one time?
It won't. Why should it?
They just closed part of the interstate.
They would want to do that, of course.
Why would they?
They just would. It's a sensible precaution. It's a way to facilitate movement
Hold on,
of
Helen.
service
Jack is
vehicles
here.
and such.
The Stovers say
Any
the spill
number
from the
of
tank car
reasons
was
that have nothing to
35,000
do
gallons.
with
She
the
said her girls were
wind or
complaining of
wind
sweaty
direction.
palms.
There's been a correction. Told them they ought to be throwing up.
Is anyone nauseous? Okay. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, stay in touch. The Stovers spoke directly with the weather center outside Glasgow. They're not calling it a feathery plume anymore.
Well, what are they calling it?
A black billowing cloud.
That's more accurate, which means they're coming to grips with the thing. It's good.
That was essentially March 6th of
Right.
2020.
I love Adam's delivery there. Oh, why should it?
Yeah.
So you're reading the book, early pandemic. At what point did you sort of think, I might want to adapt this into a movie? This might be the next thing that I'm going to take on.
Well, I think it was essentially I tricked myself into doing it because I really did start doing it. I didn't have the rights even. I mean, I knew that A24 had them, but I just started to play around with it and start writing and holding the book open and sometimes then I figured out I could put something on the book and then I could just do it. So then it was because I really wasn't sure if I felt I could do it or that I would be something that I would want to do, but I was just so drawn to the story and the telling of it, and then I would read things to Greta, and then I would show her things, and she was encouraging, and I called Adam and I said, why don't you read this book and see what you think, if it's something you might want to play, and he's older than you, it's different, but might be kind of fun thing for you. And so he read it and he was excited, and it just kind of went in increments, and then I started reaching out to people, and but I think at that time too, none of us had any idea when if anything was going to happen. People say, when are you going to shoot the movie? I'd say, I mean, I have no idea. I don't know. I haven't left my living room. So, and then eventually there we were, and I was flying to, it was like the first time I'd left, any kind of like really gone out of my, some small range. I flew to Ohio and scouted in February, I guess, of 21, and then we were shooting in the summer. And we were shooting during the Delta and with masks, and it was really kind of wild experience, and to think about that we accomplished this during that time.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm curious just about adapting generally, because you don't normally adapt other people's work, but this also isn't your first attempt at it. I mean, famously, there's an unproduced pilot of The Corrections that you worked on with Jonathan Friends, and so I'm curious if you're interested in adaptation generally, and also if you could give us a shot-by-shot retelling of what's in that pilot, please.
We just lifted everything. I think I'm interested in, I make movies that are personal to me, and that's up until now always been things that I've written whole cloth, but this felt personal to me. I really did feel like I wanted to be able to sort of express myself about the moment. I mean, not just the pandemic, but even just, I feel like, the last few years. And I didn't want to do it in a literal way, and I didn't have a story. I didn't have something that I felt I could do, and I really did feel like this was a way to express something very personal to me. So it is an adaptation, but I feel the movie for me feels, as personal as anything, really. So it's not like, I'd like to do more adaptations. It's more like if I read something that I felt sort of similarly about, maybe. But I mean, I'm writing an original script now again, so I think I've always had this feeling. I mean, I think when I read any book that I'm really involved in, that there's a part of me that thinks about the movie of it, but more as a passing thought. I'm visualizing it, and I don't actually kind of go further than that. But this time I did.
Mm-hmm. And so, in that process, was there a moment for you that where you could see it, where it was kind of unlocked, where you were like, okay, this is my way into doing this as a script?
Well, I think because the book I really, what I found was an opportunity to find these like cinematic analogs for what he was doing in a very literary way. But the book is all about American culture and how we're inundated with product and TV and radio and movies and a lot of visual media, and so I was excited about the sort of visual opportunities and ways to push in that direction. I mean, because the novel and the book the novel and the movie have different tone shifts and different genre elements, and and that all have sort of cinematic equivalents to them. And because it was taking place in the 80s, and I grew up in the 80s, and I read the book in the 80s, I was interested in not entirely, but sort of 80s interpretations of some of these genre elements, film noir in the 80s, or family comedy in the 80s, or disaster movie elements in the 80s. So I was sort of using a kind of language that was inspired by that. And that was exciting to me, because I felt it was a way to play, in some ways, another tune that the book was alluding to, but it can't do because it's a novel, and it isn't. He does a thing in the novel where when there'll be a paragraph, and then there'll be just a line from the radio or the television, just as its own line, or just suddenly the word Panasonic appears, and which is brilliant, and it's such a kind of great novel thing, a great writing thing. And so I then thought, thinking about, or all the sort of dialogue and the kids and the talking, and I was so, I should say not just visual ideas, but audio ideas, and thinking about Robert Altman movies and how he would, and this is something actually I started and experimented or played with on Marriage Story, which was miking everybody, in big groups, so everybody would talk at once, and then I would have control of the different, but they would, so you could make a cacophony, or you could kind of break it down and really push one person to the forefront. And something, if you know Robert Altman's movies, he obviously did this it really could become kind of abstract, or like McCabe and Mrs. Miller. It becomes this sort of its own music, and so I found that was exciting for me too with this with the movie. You see it a little bit in the scene we saw, the first kitchen scene. They're all talking over each other, and it's like it becomes this sort of like a song in a way, and then to marry that to a certain kind of choreography and movement, So I felt like I could take kind of real life and then put it in this sort of slightly abstract area, and that again would, to me, sort of was a way to kind of represent that strangeness I was talking about.
Yeah, and I'm curious if making the film made you see the book or DeLillo's work in a new way. Did you kind of achieve that sort of mind meld with his voice when you were in the writing of it?
Well, you have to in some ways, and also once there becomes a point in the adaptation where I think this is true even in an original script too, where there becomes a point where all the ideas and notes I've taken or things that once the script is taking its own shape, those things become they have to become integrated, or they don't, or they have to go. And they may have gotten you this far, but sometimes you've got to leave them behind. And it's with an adaptation, it's similar, because you have the stuff from the book, and now you've kind of wrestled it into this and kind of kneaded it into this different form, and then that is what I'm looking at now. And there's a point where I'm not looking at the book as often, so I'm moving stuff around. I'm writing additional stuff. I'm writing my own stuff, my own, and I'm writing it in some ways in the style of it, but I'm also, as you say, I'm in a kind of meld with it, so I'm not thinking of it that way. I'm just writing what sounds now like the characters to me, so I'm adding, putting things in. What's interesting is that when I was shooting it, sometimes I would go back to the book because I was thinking, oh, maybe get another piece of dialogue for here or something, and I realized the characters in the book were no longer the characters they're related to them, but the characters in the movie now, to me, felt different. It was a different Jack Gladney, it was a different Babette, it was different, and that the book was now something that I had to leave behind in a way. I mean, I still would use it where I could, but and this might sound, I don't know if this will make total sense, but like, the movie that I made is not the movie that was playing in my head while I read the book. I was playing the movie of the book, or whatever. I was with the book that because the book, the characters were still sort of abstractions in a way. Whatever happens when you read, you form faces or things or half faces, or and once they become real actors and the real sets, and they all, have hair and noses and eyes. It's like it becomes something different, and it grounds it in a different way, and it becomes something totally different. So it's the movie I made of the book, but I don't know if it was the movie I saw when I read the book.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk about the scale of it a little bit. You mentioned earlier some of the homages to 80s movies, and then people see the movie. There's some fun homages to like E.T., and I saw a little bit of even Independence Day or National Lampoon's Vacation. What was it like taking on a project or a story of this scale? I mean, usually your stories are much more intimate. So what was that like? How did that suit you? I imagine there are a lot more people involved.
Yeah, well, I mean, and during COVID too, it was more people than I'd been around in a long time. It was, it's storytelling, and these are all sort of elements of movies that I've always been interested in. I just haven't written the material to support those sorts of things. And so that was exciting for me. It posed different challenges, but it's all movie making. It's all kind of the same thing. It's just you might have more people. But we were shooting in Ohio, and we used a lot of the things in the college at the beginning. A lot of real families came and and they auditioned, and I, cast them, and when they're in the barracks, and there were a lot. It was quite nice because it was a real kind of community, and they were all very excited, unlike in New York City where everyone's just annoyed, including myself, when you're walking. God, the Blacklist is shooting, or whatever. What time? Right. I'll make sure to stay inside. There, everybody was really excited, and kind of it was like and that was a nice thing to see, because I feel like it's nice when you're making a movie and people feel enthusiastic, and everybody's excited to be there, but yeah, the scope was, I was sort of thinking of a lot of those movies you mentioned, but I didn't really look at them again. I just sort of had them in mind as I, sort of approached these sequences.
Yeah. Well, there's a great sequence. I think you shot in some colleges in Ohio, and there's a great sequence between Don Cheadle and Adam, and I think we can look at that clip now. That's the second clip, Mama's Boy, where they're both speaking at a lecture that Don Cheadle's character is giving.
How long were you out there?
Denise said 2.5 minutes. Is that considered long or short?
Anything that puts you into skin and orifice contact with the actual missions means we have a situation. So this is igniting the
Congratulations.
whole new generation of toxic waste.
Hitler is what we call a mama's boy.
Elvis could hardly bear to let Gladys out of his sight as her condition grew worse. He kept vigil at the hospital.
When his mother became severely ill, Hitler put a bed in the kitchen to be closer to her.
Elvis fell
He
apart
cooked and
when
cleaned.
Gladys died.
He wept at the grave
fondled
and fell into
nuzzled
a
her in
period
the
of
casket.
depression and self-pity.
He talked their baby talk.
For the rest of his life,
Seems
Hitler
fairly
couldn't
certain
bear
that
to be
Gladys's
near
death
Christmas decorations
caused a
because his
fundamental
mother
shift
had died near a
at the
Christmas
center
tree.
of the king's worldview.
Years later, in
Elvis
the grip
began to
of
withdraw
self-myth and deep remoteness, Hitler
to enter
put
a state of his
portrait
own
mother in
dying.
his Spartan quarters at Obersalzberg. He began to hear a buzzing in his left ear.
Elvis fulfilled the terms of his contract. Excess, deterioration, self-destructiveness, grotesque behavior, a physical bloating, and a series of insults to the brain, self-delivered. His place in legend is secure. He bought off the skeptics by dying early, horribly, unnecessarily. No one could deny him now. His mother probably saw it all, as on a 19-inch screen, years before her own death.
Picture Hitler near the end, trapped in his Fuhrer bunker beneath the burning city. He looks back to the early days of his power, when crowds came, mobs of people overrunning the courtyard, singing patriotic songs, painting swastikas on the walls, on the flanks of farm animals. Crowds came to his mountain villa. Crowds came to hear him speak. Crowds erotically charged the masses he once called his only bride. Crowds came to be hypnotized by the voice, the party anthems, the torchlight parades. But wait!
Tell me about blocking that scene. They're so great. I think Don Cheadle should be your new muse, by the way. He's so great in this film.
I love Don, yeah.
Tell me about blocking that.
Well, I worked, this is something also that I started on Marriage Story, because that had a theatrical component, because they have a theater troupe and there's a play, and I worked with the choreographer David Newman, who's a wonderful choreographer, actor, performer, and he actually came. I approached him about white noises, and this was something we started doing on Marriage Story. Was not just have working together on the theatrical stuff, but actually thinking about just general scenes of background and movement. And I thought, well, it'd be great to even consult with him about that, like, you know, even when we're at the Knickerbocker downtown, you know. And so on this, because I wanted the movement to be, to sort of have, you know, be realistic-ish, but also have a kind of otherness to it. And so he was involved in pretty much all the scenes, but then a scene like this, it's very choreographed. So you know, it's this lecture that, I know people haven't read the book or seen the movie, but Don's character is lecturing about Elvis, and then Adam comes in and sort of adds Hitler to it, and it becomes this sort of melding of the two. And so we choreographed it like a dance, but also knowing that we were going to intercut this. You see a little of it there at the very end, but we're going to intercut this train crash, which is what produces the toxic cloud. And so the train crash was also sort of designed to go with their movement and the sort of dance-like movement. So when Adam would do something, the train would, you know, or the truck or however, would also have a kind of corresponding gesture. So it took a lot of rehearsal and a lot of work. And then, of course, you also have this sort of the audio of it too, where they are talking over each other. It's sort of almost call and response or finishing each other's sentences. But again, it sort of starts to then this story of Hitler and his mother and Elvis and his mother start to, you know, combine in some way that, you know, essentially become kind of nonsensical. But and so yeah, that was the thing. I mean, and then you have people like Don and Adam who are, you know, just wonderful movers and performers and really kind of take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. All right. How are we doing on time? I think we have a little bit more before we get to audience questions. But you were talking about the choreography of that scene, and there's a great dance number during the credits of the film. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and also the music, because you have an original song from LCD Sound System. So what was it like thinking of which came first, and tell me about working with James Murphy?
Well, that's also just the thing of adaptation too, or screenwriting or any kind of writing, I suppose, but I was reacting at the end of the movie. The novel ends in the supermarket, and they're in the supermarket, which has sort of been described as a kind of waiting place between life and death, and it's sort of so it's an actual supermarket, but it, you know, and of course this idea of like going back to shop after all of this drama has occurred reminded me sort of the feelings after 9/11, the sort of, you know, well, let's all just go, you know, shop, and it, of course, the supermarket took on another meaning with the pandemic, and sort of, you know, the trips to the supermarket as these events that we would go through, and scary, and so you know, all of this was sort of in mind, but not being addressed in any kind of literal way. But the dance at the end of the movie goes to what I was talking about sort of when movies suddenly give you permission to break form or change something, or something becomes possible that wasn't possible even a few minutes before. And in working with David Newman and choreographing, I felt like it was almost as if people could almost break into dance or song at any moment, but don't. And then in the end, suddenly it creates a kind of possibility. And because this sequence in the supermarket at the end it's many things, and on one hand, it could be seen more satirically or cynically in that, you know, here we are just shopping till we die. I didn't want to look at it quite that way. I felt it could be a kind of joyous sort of celebration of life, which is also a celebration of death. I mean, the movie essentially is about in sort of this notion that maybe to fully live life is to also to invite in death, so David and I looked at the sort of in lots of different cultures, different kind of dances of death, mourning, and many of them were quite joyous in there, and David worked that into it. And then I reached out to James Murphy, who was a close friend of mine. We worked together on Greenberg, movie I made, and have remained friends. And I said, I think you'd be great for this, because he essentially, I was like, you could write a really like a great dance song that's about death, and I feel like that would be up your alley. And so he was brought in while we were shooting, and we had to figure out the tempo so we could work. He could create a tempo that we could choreograph to, and then later he wrote the full song.
Yeah, it's a fantastic song, so thank you for that. Did we have audience questions? Because I can keep going otherwise. Thank you so much. Yeah. So there's one from maybe a writer who's asking about how many scripts that you've had that have not been made, and how did you kind of deal with that?
Well, I mean, my first movie I made was called Kicking and Screaming, and I was 24 when I made it. I was 25 when it came out, and then I made another movie soon after that called Mr. Jealousy, and those were the first two scripts I'd ever written, and I was very young, and I then went through a period after that where I was having difficulty getting anything made, and I wrote a bunch of scripts during that period and didn't take it well. But in retrospect, it was important for me. I think it kind of was a period of growth in my own life, which also I think helped me kind of grow into the person, the filmmaker that I am, and so when I made The Squid and the Whale, which was I think 8 years after Mr. Jealousy, I'd written myself. I basically wrote myself into that script, and I wrote many things that that either I didn't finish or couldn't get made, or I wrote some things for television. I was kind of searching in a way through the writing, and in that I think I started to trust a kind of different voice, a voice that felt more like my voice than these other things that I was writing. And instead of trying to write what I thought was the kind of thing that should be a movie, I started to write something that felt like a movie that I would make. And that was The Squid and the Whale, which was a kind of, a personal breakthrough in that way. And then I did get that movie made, and then it kind of started me on the path that I've been on since.
Yeah. We have a number of questions about Adam and your working relationship with him. He's great in this film. He's done so many different things with you over the years. So what was it like working with him this time, and what is it about him as an actor or a collaborator that keeps you coming back?
Well, Adam is tireless as I am in terms of the work and wanting to to explore as much as we can in a scene while we're shooting. And and he's always surprises me. You know, he both interprets, you know, I think he connects to the language of my movies, but he also, he does something that's purely him. And, you know, he's always incredibly prepared and thoughtful, and but also alive in the moment and wild, and will do a take where it sort of goes off to here, and then the next take is kind of back in it, but has brought some other new energy to the scene, and so I mean it's really, Greta's the same way. I mean, it's both. It's like what they say about like great poetry. It's like presents your own thoughts back to you with added majesty. You know, it's like my own words back and my own sort of interpretation of the scene, and then but it was done in this way that sort of, you know, makes it better.
Yeah. We have one other clip. I don't know if we have time, if we can show the supermarket afterlife clip, because if you see this movie and if you read the book, the supermarket is plays a big role. So if we could roll supermarket afterlife, that would be great.
The supermarket hasn't changed since the toxic event. In fact, the supermarket has only gotten better. Between the unpackaged meat and the fresh bread, it's like a Persian bazaar. Everything is fine, and will continue to be fine as long as the supermarket doesn't slip. Do you know the Tibetans believe there's a transitional state between death and rebirth? That's what I think when I come here. The supermarket is a waiting place. It recharges us spiritually. It's a gateway. Look how bright. Look how full of psychic data, waves and radiation. All the letters and numbers are here, all the colors of the spectrum, all the voices and sounds, all the code words and ceremonial phrases. We just have to know how to decipher it.
Is that the Netflix budget right there? I mean, did you have to build that whole place? Tell me about that.
Jess Goncher, who was the production designer, is amazing. That was an empty Home Depot, and they built that supermarket inside it, and it was really a masterpiece of a set. I mean, I went on it while they were working on it, and you know, we had sort of designed it together and talked about it, but when I saw what he was doing, I kind of couldn't believe it, and it gave me ideas. I mean, there's shots in there that I was inspired to do because of what he made.
Like what?
Well, the one you see. I mean, we had sort of designed that shot before, but just the use of color. I mean, we talked about the supermarket in a sense as sort of. I mean, it was this thing we talked about throughout the movie was sort of like visual, the equivalent of white noise in a visual sense, which is sort of like you see the supermarket in that shot, that wide shot. It's just all color and shape, and you know, then if you go down inside it, you're looking at very specific. You could look at a piece of chewing gum or something like very detailed. It's that that sort of cacophonous, visually cacophonous, if that's a thing, and then playing then with the specifics and how things can become kind of a blur to us, or we can really focus on these little things. And we did that throughout the movie, where we would we even go from a wide shot in the barracks where we kind of go all the way down. It's in the Boy Scout camp when they've all been evacuated there, and it goes all the way down. It becomes a close-up of a pill in her hand, and I felt like it was sort of inspired by a Hitchcock shot in Notorious. But that sort of notion of actually taking a kind of wide, it'd be like if you could, like when you have a song and then you break it down with all the tracks, and then you get, but that's, listen to McCartney's bass on, like I didn't, it's wild, And so to sort of do that, but within the narrative in a way that wouldn't be, that would feel organic in the movie.
Yeah, and someone was asking about the pressure of adapting DeLillo, and you are very faithful to it, but you make some changes here and there, and at the end there are some significant departures. I wonder how you thought about that. Like, did the specter of this, important National Book Award-winning novel enter the room for you? And did you have rules for yourself in terms of how far you would deviate or how you would translate?
Well, I didn't have it in terms of its sort of cultural impact or anything like that. I had it in that I loved it and I wanted to do it justice. But also I felt like, the way we do with all things we love, that I felt it was mine and I wanted to, and this was a way to make my thing out of it. And so I didn't think about it other than that. I mean, it's, I think part of what was exciting to me about it was its sort of otherness. It's irreality in a way. That like I was saying before, that realness, that sort of irreal thing that feels like reality sometimes. And I found it very funny, and I felt sort of a kinship. I felt like it was my sense of humor. That's what drew me to it. I wasn't, I just wanted to do it well and do it cinematically. Other than that, I mean, I think in a way it was, if I was going to adapt something, I was probably more likely to do something like this that wouldn't be as close to something that I would write myself than if I would, adapt, a novel, about that people in New York City getting a divorce or something like that.
We saw that great set. Well, was there a part that was the most fun for you to adapt, or maybe an homage to a movie that you love, that you were excited about?
That I did in the movie?
Yeah, or just what the most fun you had on set?
Well, that was the one I was describing, which is a kind of, it's a crane shot. Essentially, if you imagine this room and the crane was up there, and it kind of moves all the way down, and then someone in the back row has the pill in their hand, and then it goes down to the hand, and then it's like suddenly it's a micro close-up of the pill, and then Babette, Greta's character, takes the pill, and that was exciting. It was a shot that was kind of compelling to me because I like sort of talking about that sort of finding the needle in the haystack kind of thing. But it's also the story of the pill and the story of her, which is the sort of secrets that you don't see because you're looking at the mass and not the but it was a fun thing to shoot because it became one of those things that it was because it was very challenging, because you have both the crane arm, but the arm can't go the whole way. They have to roll it as well on wheels. And so you're going, and they're in a barracks, and everybody's sleeping on cots and things because they're all been evacuated. It's like an evacuation thing. So there was all these people running and having to lift up and move sleeping people out from the thing as the crane made its way through. And it was one of those days where you get everybody together, excited to try to, accomplish this thing. And the first take was actually quite good. And I was like, it was almost there. We're going to get this in 2 or 3. And then, of course, by take 30, we were chasing take 1 again. But it's that thing that's great on a movie when you figure you get it, and everybody, has sort of done it together, and which is, a pleasure.
We saw in the clip where they were talking about Hitler and Elvis, sort of the rhythm and the music of the language, and I feel like that's something that both you and DeLillo are highly attuned to, is is the beauty of language and the uses of language. But part of what's so funny about the movie and about the book is he's also showing you the limits of language and the futility of it. You know,
Right.
These are some of the most articulate characters that you're ever going to see, but it doesn't do them much good
Right.
in the end. So I'm curious what you saw, or what was interesting to you about the way these characters talk.
Well, I think you said it. And it's something in many of my movies of people who kind of are sort of talking in some ways to figure it out. You know, I mean, and often, you know, and people who, you know, are. You know, think language is going to save them, or you know, think facts or their knowledge or being right or wrong, or and search, you know, and also how language is a form of connection between people, and then also how you can both be talking in a room and be totally far apart, and as you say, DeLillo does that. On a kind of grander scale in the novel, and sort of, you know, so you have, you know, for instance, it's in that kitchen scene, you have the kids talking, Jack talking, the TV is on, Heinrich's listening to the radio at the same time, Babette comes in, she's got someone on the phone, you know, and they're all kind of having the same conversation, but they're all having their own experience, and I like doing that visually. I mean, to me, it reminds me of sort of screwball comedies, you know, the 30s and 40s, the sort of Howard Hawks, George Cukor, Ernst Lubitsch, Billy Wilder, that sort of fast-talking, fast-moving, people talking over each other, and the dialogue's great, and it's just a pleasure. And I like kind of trying to find ways to bring that into maybe a more realistic environment. I mean, this being a kind of real and unreal, but like Marriage Story has some sequences like that too, as does Meyerowitz. I mean, all my movies do, and you know, because I find it kind of inherently funny also, but it also, there is this, I think it's true, and true how, you know, and often articulate people, how they use language as a way to defend or, you know, and I'm also interested in identity and collective identity, you know, the identity of a family and family stories and family mythologies and things that we're told by our parents, the things we think are true, the way, you know, Squid and the Whale is all about that from a kid's perspective, and then Meyerowitz Stories is that from an adult perspective of like trying to find your own voice in a highly, you know, in a world with many voices, and it was in DeLillo's novel too, and it's in this, is that it, you know, and then, but you also, I mean, Murray has that line, family is as the cradle of the world's misinformation, which is a great line of DeLillo's, but sort of how family is a kind of microcosm of the culture, you know, and it was something we obviously have seen a lot over the last few years, is sort of how language starts to lose meaning and how we're trying to talk our way out of things and using the same words to mean totally different things, the same expressions, you know, internet speak, all of those things. And to me, that was another, you know, layer of the book that was, you know, compelling to me in terms of, you know, the movie.
All right. Well, we're getting the wrap signal, but thank you for talking with us. This has definitely been a meaningful
Thank you, Reggie.
conversation.
Yeah,
Let's
appreciate
hear it again for Noah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.